Prison ships, as it turns out, follow a remarkably consistent design philosophy across the galaxy. Take the most inhospitable chunk of metal you can engineer, cram it full of beings who would cheerfully disembowel their own grandmothers for sport, and then act surprised when things get messy. The Nexus Perdition was no exception to this rule, though it did manage to elevate the concept to something approaching an art form. Suspended in the cold void between star systems, the massive vessel resembled nothing so much as a mechanical tumor. All harsh angles and defensive plating, bristling with enough weaponry to reduce a small moon to constituent atoms. Its builders, a particularly paranoid species of insectoids known as the Vexi, had designed it with one simple principle in mind: what goes in doesn't come out. Inside, the ship's ecosystem operated on the kind of brutally efficient hierarchy that would make a corporate boardroom weep with envy. At the top sat the apex predators, creatures so monumentally dangerous that their very existence had prompted entire civilizations to develop new curse words. Below them, a carefully maintained food chain of lesser horrors, each more inventive in their methods of violence than the last. The current undisputed champion of this charming social order was a crystalline entity that the guards had helpfully designated as Prisoner 747491X, though the other inmates had taken to calling it the Harvester in hushed, terrified whispers. Standing nearly 4 meters tall when fully extended, its body was composed of what appeared to be living diamond, each facet sharp enough to slice through reinforced hull plating. But its true horror lay not in its physical form, impressive though that was, but in its method of sustenance. The Harvester fed on fear itself, not metaphorically, as some poet might describe a particularly nasty bureaucrat, but literally. It consumed the biochemical cocktail of terror that flowed through its victims' nervous systems, savoring each spike of adrenaline like a connoisseur sampling vintage wine. The process was invariably fatal, leaving behind desiccated husks that had died not from physical trauma, but from the complete exhaustion of their own capacity for terror. The other apex predators gave it a respectful birth. There was More Render, a creature that resembled what might happen if someone crossed a great white shark with a particularly vindictive nightmare and gave it opposable thumbs. Its hide was scarred from countless battles, each mark a testament to its survival against odds that would make a mathematician weep. Then there was the Void Stalker, a shadow given malevolent form, capable of existing in 11 dimensions simultaneously and possessing an unfortunate tendency to rearrange the internal organs of anything that annoyed it. The guards, for their part, maintained order through a combination of neural disruptors, automated defense systems, and the kind of casual brutality that comes naturally to a species that had evolved from hive-mind predators. The Vexi chittered among themselves in their clicking language, placing bets on various forms of inmate entertainment. Today's odds were particularly favorable for what they called meat tenderizing, the delightful process by which new arrivals were systematically broken down by the established hierarchy, which brought them to the day's newest addition to their collection. The transport shuttle that docked with the Nexus Perdition was unremarkable in every possible way, a standard prisoner transfer vessel that had seen better decades. Its hull bore the scars of countless journeys through hostile space, each dent and burn mark telling the story of another successful delivery to the galaxy's various correctional facilities. The pilot, a bored-looking Zentorian with the kind of expression that suggested he'd rather be literally anywhere else, barely bothered to verify the transfer codes before shoving his cargo out the airlock. What emerged was, by any reasonable galactic standard, utterly unremarkable. The human female stood perhaps 1.75 meters tall, with the kind of build that suggested regular exercise without the bulk that marked professional fighters. Her hair, a shade of brown that most species would have described as dirt-colored, had been pulled back into a practical style that wouldn't interfere with vision or movement. Her clothing, standard-issue prisoner garments, hung on her frame in a way that somehow managed to be both loose and form-fitting simultaneously. The Vexi guards exchanged what passed for amused glances among their kind, mandibles clicking in the insectoid equivalent of laughter. Here was their entertainment for the day, a single human, looking for all the world like she'd wandered into the wrong section of space by accident. Death World Species, one guard chittered to another, consulting his datapad. Designation, human. Homeworld gravity 9.8 standard units. Atmospheric composition oxygen-nitrogen mix. Threat assessment. He paused, mandibles twitching in what might have been mirth. Moderate. In a facility that housed creatures capable of dissolving reality itself through sheer malevolence, they had classified this particular specimen as moderate. The betting pools were already forming, with odds heavily favoring her survival being measured in minutes rather than hours. The human herself seemed blissfully unaware of the impression she was making. She stood quietly in the processing chamber, hands at her sides, eyes moving in small, economical movements that took in her surroundings without appearing to stare. To the guards, this appeared to be the kind of wide-eyed terror that new arrivals typically displayed. They had seen it countless times before. The gradual dawning realization that they had entered a place where the normal rules of civilization had been not just suspended, but actively mocked. Cell Block 7, the lead guard decided, his translator rendering his chittering into galactic standard. General population should be amusing. Cell Block 7 was where they kept the middle-tier predators. Creatures dangerous enough to warrant separation from civilian populations, but not quite apocalyptic enough to require solo confinement. It was, in the grand tradition of prison hierarchies, where the real testing happened. New arrivals were thrown into the mix to see what would rise to the surface and what would be efficiently processed into component atoms. As the human was led through the corridors of the Nexus Perdition, word of her arrival spread through the inmate population with the kind of efficiency that only prison communications could achieve. Creatures that had been content to spend their time in quiet contemplation of various forms of mayhem suddenly found themselves intensely interested in the newest addition to their community, the Harvester. Feeling the first delicious tremors of terror beginning to emanate from Cell Block 7, extended its crystalline consciousness to taste the new arrival's fear. What it found was puzzling. There was something there, certainly, but it was wrapped in layers of something else. Something that the creature's ancient and terrible intelligence couldn't quite categorize. No matter. Fear had a way of revealing itself given the proper encouragement. The betting pools were now accepting wagers on everything from time of death to method of disposal. The smart money was on psychological breakdown followed by creative dismemberment, with a few optimistic souls putting small stakes on manages to last through the first meal period. What none of them realized, not the guards, not the inmates, not even the Harvester with its eons of experience in passing the emotional spectrums of 1,000 different species, was that they were operating under a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of their new neighbor. The human was not afraid. She was patient. Cell Block 7 operated on the kind of social dynamics that would have fascinated anthropologists, assuming any anthropologists were suicidal enough to conduct field research in a maximum security prison ship. The pecking order was established through a combination of demonstrated violence, territorial displays, and the occasional philosophical debate conducted entirely through interpretive disembowelment. The human cell was located in what the inmates had designated as neutral territory, a section of the block where the various factions maintained an uneasy truce, primarily because the previous occupants had been so thoroughly obliterated that their constituent molecules were still being scraped off the walls. It was, the guards reasoned, the perfect place for their newest form of entertainment to establish herself before the real festivities began. What followed was a masterclass in misinterpreted behavior that would have been comedy gold if it weren't taking place in a facility designed to contain the galaxy's most creative sociopaths. The human settled into her new accommodations with the kind of methodical efficiency that her observers interpreted as nervous energy. She examined the cell's dimensions, tested the structural integrity of the sleeping platform, and conducted what appeared to be a thorough inventory of available resources. To the watching inmates, this looked like the frantic preparations of someone desperately trying to fortify a position against inevitable assault. In reality, she was conducting a tactical assessment with the kind of professional thoroughness that would have impressed military strategists across 3 galactic sectors. The first test came during the evening meal distribution. The prison's cafeteria was a study in controlled chaos, with different species segregated into their own sections to prevent the kind of interspecies incidents that required industrial-grade cleaning equipment to resolve. Food was dispensed through automated systems that had been designed to prevent the dispensers themselves from being weaponized, a necessary precaution after the infamous ladle massacre of 2387. The human took her place in the queue with the same quiet efficiency she had demonstrated in everything else. She accepted her meal, a grey gelatinous substance that was allegedly nutritious but looked like it had been scraped from the bottom of a particularly pessimistic ocean, and found an empty table in the designated human-compatible section. This was where the Vorthak twins decided to make their introduction. The Vorthak were a species that had evolved from pack hunters on a world where the primary form of entertainment was trying to avoid being eaten by literally everything else. They stood roughly 2 meters tall, with elongated limbs that ended in razor-sharp claws, and faces that suggested what might happen if someone crossed a wolf with a particularly vindictive accountant. The twins had earned their reputation through a series of incidents that had left their previous cellmates in a state that could charitably be described as abstract art. They approached the humans' table with the kind of swagger that comes from never having encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through the application of sufficient violence. The smaller of the two, though smaller was relative when dealing with creatures that could bench press a small spacecraft, slammed his claws down on the table with enough force to leave gouges in the reinforced metal. "New meat," he growled, his translator rendering the complex harmonics of his native language into something approximating galactic standard. "You sitting in our spot." The human looked up from her meal with the kind of expression that suggested she was mildly surprised to discover she wasn't alone. Her eyes, a shade of brown that somehow managed to be both warm and completely cold at the same time, met those of the Vortak for exactly 3 seconds before returning to her food. "I don't see any names carved here," she said, her voice carrying the kind of mild politeness that suggested she was discussing the weather rather than territorial disputes in a maximum security prison. The inmates at nearby tables, who had been watching the interaction with the kind of fascination usually reserved for impending natural disasters, began to murmur among themselves. This was not how these conversations typically went. New arrivals usually responded with either immediate submission or desperate aggression. This was something else entirely. The larger Vorthak twin decided to clarify the situation. He reached across the table and grabbed the human's meal tray, his claws leaving deep scratches in the metal as he dragged it toward himself. "Now you understand," he said, his mandibles clicking in what passed for amusement among his species. The human watched her meal disappear with the kind of expression that suggested she was making mental notes about something. Then, without any visible change in her demeanor, she stood up and walked away. The Vorthak twins exchanged glances that conveyed a mixture of satisfaction and mild disappointment. They had been hoping for more entertainment, but at least the territorial boundaries had been established according to the traditional protocols. What they failed to notice was the way the human moved as she walked away. Her gait was neither hurried nor slow, but there was something in the precise placement of each step that suggested a kind of controlled energy. The few inmates who had spent time in actual war zones recognized it immediately, though they couldn't quite articulate what they were seeing. The human was not retreating, she was withdrawing to a position of tactical advantage. Over the following days, the pattern repeated itself, with minor variations. The Harvester's lieutenants, a collection of nightmarish entities that had earned their positions through demonstrated competence in the field of creative murder, began testing the human's boundaries with the kind of systematic approach that suggested they were conducting a research project. There was the Bone Sculptor, a creature that resembled a cross between a praying mantis and a particularly artistic serial killer, who had developed the habit of leaving elaborate skeletal arrangements outside the human's cell. The human would examine these displays with the kind of professional interest that suggested she was taking notes on technique. The Void Stalker attempted its traditional intimidation display, manifesting in 11 dimensions simultaneously and filling the corridor with the kind of reality-bending presence that had reduced hardened criminals to gibbering wrecks. The human glanced up from her reading. She had somehow acquired a datapad and was working her way through what appeared to be technical manuals, nodded politely, and returned to her studies. The betting pools were becoming increasingly creative in their predictions. The guards had moved beyond simple survival estimates and were now taking wagers on increasingly specific scenarios. Would she last long enough to develop a proper neurosis? Would she achieve a complete psychological breakdown before or after the first major beating? The odds were constantly shifting as the inmates developed new and innovative theories about their newest neighbor's eventual fate. The harvester itself was beginning to take a more active interest in the proceedings. The crystalline entity had been sampling the human's emotional output with the kind of professional curiosity that a sommelier might bring to a particularly unusual vintage. What it found was complex. There were layers of controlled response that suggested a mind operating on multiple levels simultaneously. Fear was there, certainly, but it was wrapped in something that the creature's ancient consciousness found frustratingly difficult to pass. It was during the third week of this careful observation that the harvester decided to take a more direct approach. The creature had grown tired of the subtle psychological games and was ready to move on to the kind of straightforward terror harvesting that had made its reputation across 17 star systems. The human was in the exercise yard, conducting what appeared to be a routine physical maintenance program. She moved through a series of exercises that looked deceptively simple, but demonstrated the kind of precise body control that suggested years of dedicated training. The other inmates gave her a wide berth, not out of respect, but out of the kind of casual disregard that predators show toward prey that hasn't yet proven worthy of serious attention. The harvester materialized in the center of the yard with the kind of dramatic flair that had become its signature. Its crystalline form caught the artificial lighting and threw it back in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The temperature in the immediate vicinity dropped by several degrees as reality itself seemed to recoil from the creature's presence. The human finished her current exercise, straightened up, and turned to face the apex predator with the kind of expression that suggested she had been expecting this moment for some time. The harvester extended its consciousness, preparing to sample the fear that should have been radiating from its newest victim like heat from a star. What it found instead was something that made its ancient and terrible mind pause in confusion. The human was not afraid of the harvester. She was evaluating it. The exercise yard had fallen silent with the kind of absolute quiet that typically preceded spectacular disasters. The harvester stood in the center like a monument to crystallized malevolence, its faceted form refracting artificial lighting into patterns that seemed to slice through the air itself. The human stood 3 meters away, her posture relaxed, but suggesting coiled potential energy. To the watching inmates, she appeared frozen in terror, a reasonable response to finding oneself near a creature that had spent millennia perfecting fear-based homicide. What they were actually witnessing was a predator taking the measure of another predator and finding the competition adequate. Fascinating, the harvester said, its voice resonating through dimensions most species couldn't perceive. You are not what you appear to be, small creature. The human tilted her head slightly. Most people aren't, she replied with the same mild politeness she had used with the Vorthak twins. Though you're pretty much exactly what you appear to be. Points for consistency. The crystalline entity's form shifted, facets realigning as it accessed memories older than most civilizations. I have fed on the terror of beings that could shatter planets with their thoughts. I have harvested fear from creatures that existed in states of matter your species has not yet discovered. And yet you, it paused, probing the human's emotional spectrum with surgical precision, you taste of something else entirely, do I? The human's response carried genuine curiosity, as if discussing an unexpected flavor rather than her psychological profile as analyzed by an extra-dimensional horror. What do I taste like? The harvester's consideration stretched across seconds that felt like hours to the watching inmates. When it answered, its voice carried something that might have been uncertainty, an emotion most observers would have sworn the creature incapable of experiencing. Patience, it said, and something underneath that I cannot identify, something that reminds me of the spaces between stars, cold, vast, and absolutely unforgiving. The human nodded as if this were perfectly reasonable. That's probably the most accurate psychological evaluation I've received in years. Though you're missing something important. And what would that be, small creature? The transformation was subtle at first. The human's posture didn't change, her expression remained mild, but something fundamental shifted. Every predatory instinct in the yard suddenly began screaming warnings. You made an assumption, the human said, her voice carrying the same tone as before, though the words seemed to hit the air with considerably more weight. You assumed I was prey. The harvester's ancient consciousness, which had spent eons cataloguing fear responses of thousands of species, suddenly encountered something completely outside its experience. The human's emotional spectrum was shifting, layers of controlled restraint peeling away to reveal something the creature's terrible intelligence couldn't process. "You threatened my home," the human said, and for the first time her voice carried something that wasn't mild politeness. "You mentioned experience with planet crackers. That suggests you've been near Earth." The harvester's crystalline form began resonating with harmonics that existed in frequencies most species couldn't hear. Those that could discovered their auditory processing centers weren't equipped to handle the sound of a creature that had never experienced genuine fear suddenly encountering it. "The answer is weakness," the human said, stepping closer. "You feed on fear because you are, at your core, a coward. You require the terror of others because you have never learned to face your own." The transformation was complete. What stood in the exercise yard was no longer a small, unremarkable human female. What stood there was something the watching inmates' minds refused to properly process. A creature that had evolved on a world where everything was trying to kill everything else, and had not only survived, but thrived to the point of reaching for the stars. The harvester made the mistake of trying to assert dominance through a full-spectrum fear assault, a psychic attack that had reduced entire civilizations to cowering remnants. The human absorbed the attack, processed it, and smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. What followed was less a fight than a systematic demolition. The human moved with precision that suggested she had been holding back her strength, speed, reflexes, and tactical awareness. The harvester discovered there was a significant difference between feeding on others' fear and facing something that had never learned to be afraid. The human dismantled the creature's power structure with methodical efficiency. She moved through the lieutenants, the bone sculptor, the void stalker, and various other horrors with the casual competence of someone conducting routine maintenance. The Vorthak twins found themselves experiencing existential terror their species had evolved to avoid. They huddled together, making whimpering sounds that suggested their worldview was undergoing rapid revision. When the violence stopped, the exercise yard looked redecorated by someone with profound understanding of anatomy and complete disregard for traditional uses of body parts. The human stood in the center, breathing slightly harder but otherwise unaffected. The harvester lay in scattered crystalline fragments that occasionally pulsed with residual energy. Its last coherent thought was recognition that it had spent its existence as an apex predator, without understanding what that term actually meant. The human looked around, her gaze taking in inmates now pressed against walls, hoping to be mistaken for decorative elements. Her expression had returned to mild politeness. "Well," she said conversationally, "I think that settles the question of territorial boundaries." The silence that followed was so complete that several inmates wondered if they had died during the violence and simply hadn't noticed yet. The aftermath of the exercise yard incident created the kind of paradigm shift that would have been classified as reality-altering, assuming anyone was brave enough to study the social dynamics of a prison ship that now housed something that had redefined apex predation. The human returned to her daily routine with methodical efficiency. She attended meals, participated in exercise periods, and continued reading technical manuals with focused attention that suggested exam preparation rather than serving time in the galaxy's most notorious correctional facility. The difference was in how everyone else behaved around her. The Vorthak twins had developed what medical staff charitably described as acute territorial displacement syndrome. They spent days pressed into the farthest corner of their cell, communicating only in whispers and exhibiting hypervigilant behavior typically associated with prey animals who had discovered they were sharing habitat with something considerably higher up the food chain. The harvester's former lieutenants had adopted various coping strategies, none particularly effective. The bone sculptor had ceased its artistic endeavors entirely, apparently having lost interest in creative expression after witnessing what could be accomplished with sufficient motivation and complete understanding of structural engineering principles applied to living organisms. The void stalker had stopped manifesting in 11 dimensions simultaneously, now limiting itself to a single, carefully contained dimensional state, apparently concluding that drawing attention was no longer viable. The guards were experiencing their own professional crisis. The Vexi had built their correctional philosophy around containing dangerous predators through superior firepower and strategic intimidation. Discovering they had unknowingly imprisoned something that made their previous, most dangerous inmates look like aggressive house pets had prompted urgent communications with administrative headquarters. The betting pools had evolved into something resembling religious experience. Guards no longer wagered on when the human might be killed, but instead focused on predictions about how other inmates would react to her presence. Current favorites included number of inmates developing neuroses and frequency of submissive behavior displays. The human seemed completely oblivious to her profound psychological impact. She continued conducting herself with the same quiet politeness that had initially led everyone to dismiss her as harmless. She said please and thank you to automated dispensers, nodded politely when paths crossed, and maintained a perfectly pleasant demeanor. This studied normalcy was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the entire situation. The most telling incident occurred during the third week of what guards had begun calling the new normal. A recently arrived inmate, a massive creature from the Andorian cluster, resembling what might happen if someone crossed a bear with dective geological formation, attempted to establish dominance through traditional intimidation. The human was reading in the common area when the creature approached, its rocky hide scraping against walls. Every other inmate immediately adopted playing dead behavior. They froze in place, some literally lying down, others pressing against walls with stillness that suggested they hoped to be mistaken for furniture. The new arrival, confused by this response, proceeded with its intimidation display. It reared to full height, nearly 3 meters of animated granite, with claws that could carve through hull plating, and released a roar that resonated through the ship's superstructure. The human looked up from her reading, glanced at the creature with mild interest one might show toward unexpected but unthreatening weather, and returned to her book. The silence that followed was so profound that several inmates later reported hearing their own circulatory systems operating. The massive creature stood there for 30 seconds, processing this complete lack of response. Then, with careful deliberation that suggested it was reconsidering several life choices, it slowly backed away and found somewhere else to be. The human never looked up from her reading again. The incident became the subject of intensive discussion among inmates, though conducted in whispers and only when the human was safely out of auditory range. The consensus was both simple and terrifying. They were no longer the dangerous ones. The guards had begun requesting transfers to other facilities. The official reason was career advancement opportunities, but the real motivation was increasingly obvious. Beings who had chosen careers managing the galaxy's most violent criminals were discovering limits to their appetite for occupational hazards. The human continued her routine, apparently unaware that she had become the subject of reverent terror typically reserved for natural disasters. She read her manuals, completed exercise routines, and maintained the pleasant, mild-mannered demeanor that had initially convinced everyone she was harmless. The irony was not lost on philosophically inclined inmates, though they kept observations to themselves. The greatest predator among them was the one who had never needed to prove it. She had simply been patient, polite, and professional, right up until the moment she demonstrated exactly why those qualities were possible. The Nexus Perdition had become exactly what its designers intended, a facility where the most dangerous creatures in the galaxy were safely contained. They had simply misunderstood which creature was the most dangerous. The human finished another chapter, made a small notation in the margin, and prepared for another day of quietly terrifying the galaxy's most feared predators through the simple expedient of existing in their general vicinity. Some lessons, it seemed, were best taught through practical demonstration.